Boston, Massachusetts. September 1903. The morning air carried the sharp scent of coal smoke and wet cobblestones as Samuel Porter adjusted his leather camera bag and stepped into the narrow streets of the textile district. At 32 years old, Samuel had spent the last decade photographing the changing face of American industry, but lately, his work had taken on a different purpose. He wasn't just documenting progress anymore. He was documenting the cost. The assignment came from the newly formed National Child Labor Committee, a group of reformers determined to expose the conditions in which thousands of children worked across the nation. Samuel had been skeptical at first. Everyone knew children worked. It was simply how things were. Families needed the income, factories needed the workers, and the economy kept moving forward. But after his first visit to a coal mine in Pennsylvania 6 months ago, something inside him shifted. The image of children emerging from the darkness, their faces blackened with dust, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, haunted him. Still, today's location was the Lowell Mills, a massive textile factory that employed over 2,000 workers. The building stretched along the Merrimack River like a fortress of brick and iron, its smokestacks piercing the gray morning sky. Samuel had arranged this visit through a contact at the factory, a floor supervisor named Thomas Brennan who had quietly expressed concerns about the youngest workers. The arrangement was delicate. Factory owners didn't appreciate outsiders documenting their operations, especially photographers with reformist sympathies. Samuel presented his credentials at the main gate. The guard, a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes, examined the letter of permission before waving him through. Inside, the noise hit him like a physical force. The clattering of looms, the grinding of machinery, the shouts of supervisors trying to be heard over the din. The air was thick with cotton fibers that caught the light streaming through the high windows, creating an almost dreamlike haze that belied the harsh reality of the work being done. Thomas Brennan met him near the entrance to the main floor. He was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands. "Mr. Porter," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I appreciate your discretion in this matter. The owners know you're here to document our operations, but they don't know the full nature of your assignment." "I understand," Samuel replied. "I'll be respectful and quick." "There's something I want you to see," Thomas said, his voice dropping lower. "Follow me to the spinning room." They walked through corridors lined with massive machines, past workers who barely glanced up from their tasks. The spinning room was on the second floor, a vast space filled with rows of spinning frames that twisted raw cotton into thread. The temperature was stifling, kept intentionally high to prevent the fibers from breaking. Samuel felt sweat immediately begin to soak through his shirt, and then he saw them. Children. Dozens of them. Boys and girls who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, moving between the machines with practiced efficiency. They wore simple clothes, mostly patched and worn, and their faces bore expressions far too serious for their ages. But it was Thomas's next words that made Samuel truly focus. "Watch their feet," Thomas said quietly. Samuel looked down. Many of the children were working barefoot on the factory floor, which was covered with a mix of cotton lint, oil stains, and various debris. Those who did have shoes wore items so worn and inadequate that they offered little protection. One girl, no more than 10, had shoes that were clearly several sizes too small, the leather split at the seams. A boy nearby had wrapped his feet in strips of cloth that were already coming undone. "They can't afford proper shoes," Thomas explained. "The wages they earn barely cover food. Their families choose between shoes and eating. The floor supervisors don't care. As long as they can work, that's all that matters. But the injuries..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Samuel felt his chest tighten. He had seen poverty before, had documented it extensively. But there was something about the feet, about this particular detail, that crystallized the entire situation in a way that felt unbearably concrete. It wasn't abstract suffering. It was specific, visible, and undeniable. "May I photograph them?" Samuel asked. "That's why I brought you here," Thomas replied. "But be careful. The floor supervisor here, Mr. Hutchins, he's not sympathetic to our concerns. If he sees you focusing too much on the conditions rather than the productivity, he'll shut this down." Samuel nodded and began to set up his camera. The large format camera required a tripod and careful composition, which meant he couldn't work quickly or discreetly. He chose a position that would capture a wide view of the room, showing the scale of the operation while also including the children in the foreground. As he worked, a girl approached him. She was perhaps 12, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid and eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Are you from the newspaper?" she asked. "I'm a photographer," Samuel replied gently. "I'm documenting the factory." "Are you going to make us look bad?" The question was direct, without any childish innocence. Samuel paused, considering his answer carefully. "I'm going to show things as they are. Nothing more, nothing less." The girl studied him for a moment, then nodded. "My name's Catherine Walsh. I've been working here for 3 years, since I was 9. My father died in a construction accident, and my mother takes in laundry, but it's not enough for all 6 of us kids. I'm the oldest, so I work here. My brother Michael works in the machine room downstairs." "Does it bother you?" Samuel asked. "Working here instead of going to school?" Catherine's expression hardened slightly. "Bothering don't put food on the table. I can read and write enough to get by. That's more than some. I send most of my wages home every week. For $50. Without it, we'd be in the poorhouse." Samuel felt the weight of her words. This wasn't a simple story of exploitation. It was economics, family survival, and impossible choices all tangled together. "May I photograph you, Catherine? You and some of the other children working?" She shrugged. "If you want. Won't change nothing, though." But Samuel hoped she was wrong. He spent the next hour carefully documenting the scene, taking multiple photographs from different angles. He captured the wide shots that showed the scale and conditions, but he also focused on details. The bare feet on the oil-stained floor. The small hands operating machinery designed for adults. The exhausted faces during a brief water break. One photograph in particular struck him as he composed it. A group of 5 children standing together during a momentary pause in the work. 3 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from about 8 to 12. They stood naturally, unself-conscious, their work-stained clothes and tired eyes telling their own story. But it was their feet that drew the eye. One boy was completely barefoot. 2 others had shoes so worn that their toes poked through the leather. The girls had slightly better footwear, but even those shoes were clearly inadequate for a factory floor. Samuel took the photograph, the chemical process capturing the image on the glass plate. He knew this image would be powerful. It showed children who looked like children everywhere, children who should have been playing or studying. Instead, they stood in a factory, their bare or poorly shod feet on the hard floor, ready to return to machines that cared nothing for their youth or vulnerability. As he packed up his equipment, Mr. Hutchins, the floor supervisor Thomas had warned him about, approached. He was a stocky man with a red face and aggressive posture. "What exactly are you photographing here, Mr. Porter?" "The operations of the factory, as authorized by management," Samuel replied calmly. "Looked to me like you were spending an awful lot of time on those kids' feet. We run a clean operation here. Those children are lucky to have work. Their families need the income." "I'm simply documenting what I see, Mr. Hutchins. The photographs will speak for themselves." The supervisor's jaw clenched, but he couldn't argue without admitting there was something to hide. "Just make sure your photographs show the full context. This factory provides honest work and honest wages. Without us, half these families would starve." Samuel nodded noncommittally and finished packing his equipment. As he prepared to leave, Catherine appeared once more. She pressed a small folded piece of paper into his hand. "My address," she whispered. "If your photographs change anything, I want to know about it." The walk back to his small studio apartment in Cambridge took nearly an hour. Samuel used the time to think about what he had witnessed. The problem wasn't simple cruelty or malice. It was a system that treated children as economic units rather than as children. It was poverty so desperate that parents had no choice but to send their children to work in dangerous conditions. It was a society that had decided this was acceptable, normal, even necessary. Back in his darkroom, Samuel began the painstaking process of developing the glass plate negatives. He worked by the dim red light, his hands moving through the familiar chemical baths. Each image emerged slowly, the details becoming clear as the chemicals did their work. When the photograph of the 5 children appeared, Samuel felt his breath catch. Even in the negative, the power of the image was undeniable. He made contact prints of the best images, carefully exposing the photographic paper under the glass negatives. As the prints developed, he studied them closely. The detail was remarkable. You could see the texture of the cotton lint on the floor, the worn threads of the children's clothes, and yes, the condition of their feet. Bare skin on industrial floors. Shoes with holes. Makeshift wrappings coming undone. Samuel's wife, Margaret, found him in the darkroom late that evening. She was a schoolteacher, a woman of strong principles and gentle demeanor. They had been married for 5 years, and she had supported his shift towards social documentary work, even though it paid less than his previous commercial photography. "What did you find today?" she asked softly, looking at the prints hanging to dry. "Evidence," Samuel replied. "Evidence of what we do to our children in the name of industry and progress." Margaret studied the photographs, her face grave. "These are powerful, Samuel. But you know how people will react. They'll say the children need to work. They'll say you're exaggerating the conditions. They'll say you're undermining the economy." "I know," Samuel said. "But I also know what I saw today. These aren't just statistics or abstract problems. These are real children with names and families and futures that are being stolen from them one exhausting day at a time. What will you do with these photographs?" "First, I'll present them to the National Child Labor Committee. Then, I hope to get them published in newspapers and magazines. I want people to see what I saw. I want them to look at these children's feet and ask themselves if this is really acceptable." Margaret squeezed his shoulder. "It won't be easy. You're challenging powerful interests." "I know," Samuel said again. "But after today, after meeting Catherine and seeing all those children, I don't think I have a choice anymore." That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Catherine's words, "won't change nothing." He thought about her $4.50 a week, about her 5 younger siblings, about her dead father and exhausted mother. He thought about the system that made her situation seem inevitable, natural, just the way things were, but systems could change. They had to change. And sometimes, Samuel believed, change began with a single image that made people truly see what they had been looking at all along. 3 weeks after his visit to the Lowell Mills, Samuel Porter sat in the modest offices of the National Child Labor Committee on Tremont Street. The organization occupied the 3rd floor of an old building that smelled of paper and pipe tobacco. Around a scarred wooden table sat 5 men and 2 women, all dedicated to the cause of child labor reform. Samuel had laid out his photographs for their review, and the room had fallen into a heavy silence. Dr. Felix Adler, the committee's chairman, held the photograph of the 5 children, studying it through his wire-rimmed spectacles. He was a philosopher and educator, a man who spoke in measured tones but whose eyes burned with conviction. "Mr. Porter," he said finally, "these are exactly what we need. Not statistics, not reports, but undeniable visual evidence that the American public cannot ignore." Lillian Wald, a nurse and social reformer who had dedicated her life to helping the poor, leaned forward. "Look at their faces," she said softly. "They're not even shocked or upset. This is normal to them. That's what breaks my heart. Children shouldn't be so resigned to suffering." "The feet are what makes this photograph different," added Edgar Murphy, a clergyman from Alabama. "Everyone knows children work in factories. But somehow, we've learned to look past it, to accept it. But this detail, the bare feet and broken shoes on a factory floor, it makes the reality impossible to ignore. It's specific. It's concrete. It demands a response." Samuel nodded. "That was exactly my intention. I could have photographed the machinery or the general conditions, but those images can be debated or contextualized away. The feet tell a story that can't be argued with. These children can't even afford proper shoes, yet they're working 10-hour days in dangerous conditions." "What was the factory's response to your visit?" asked Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House in Chicago and one of the most respected voices in social reform. Mixed, Samuel replied. I had permission to be there, secured through a sympathetic floor supervisor. But the production supervisor was hostile. He made it clear that he viewed the children's employment as a blessing for their families, not an exploitation. Florence Kelly, the committee's most fierce advocate, slammed her hand on the table. A blessing? Working barefoot on factory floors covered in oil and debris? Breathing cotton fibers that will destroy their lungs? Missing any chance at education? These people have convinced themselves that oppression is charity. That's the mindset we're fighting, Dr. Adler said. And these photographs give us a weapon. Mr. Porter, we'd like to use these images in our campaign. We'll present them to legislators, publish them in our reports, and provide them to sympathetic newspapers. Are you willing to have your work used in this way? That's why I took them, Samuel replied. But I have one request. I met a girl at the factory named Catherine Walsh. She gave me her address. If these photographs lead to any changes, I'd like to be able to tell her about it. She didn't think anything would change. I want to prove her wrong. The committee agreed, and over the next several weeks, Samuel's photographs began to circulate. The response was immediate and polarizing. Reform-minded newspapers like the Boston Globe and the New York Evening Post published the images with accompanying articles about child labor. The photograph of the 5 children became particularly prominent, reprinted in publications across the Northeast, but the opposition was fierce. Factory owners accused Samuel of manipulation and bias. Business associations published editorials claiming that child labor was economically necessary and even beneficial for the children themselves. Conservative newspapers argued that reformers were interfering with parental rights and free markets. The owner of the Lowell Mills, Marcus Thornton, was particularly vocal, calling Samuel's work propaganda designed to undermine American industry. Samuel received both praise and threats. Letters arrived at his apartment, some thanking him for his courage, others cursing him as a troublemaker and socialist. One evening, 2 men in expensive suits appeared at his door, offering him money to stop his work and recant his photographs. Samuel refused, but the encounter left him shaken. Margaret grew worried. Samuel, these are powerful people you're antagonizing. They have money, influence, connections. What if they try to hurt you? Or hurt your reputation so you can't work? Then I'll find other work, Samuel said, though he felt the same fear his wife expressed. But I can't unsee what I saw. I can't pretend those children don't exist. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A wealthy industrialist named Robert Harrison, who had made his fortune in steel, read one of the articles featuring Samuel's photographs. Harrison was known as a hard man, a believer in unfettered capitalism and self-reliance. But he was also a grandfather. When he saw the photograph of the children with their bare and damaged feet, something shifted in him. Harrison requested a meeting with Samuel. They met at a restaurant in downtown Boston, an establishment where the wealthy conducted business over expensive meals. Samuel felt out of place in his worn suit, but Harrison greeted him warmly. Mr. Porter, Harrison said after they had ordered, I'm not a sentimental man. I built my business through hard work and tough decisions. I've always believed that people need to earn their way in this world, that charity breeds dependence. But your photograph has troubled me deeply. Samuel waited, unsure where this was going. I have 5 grandchildren, Harrison continued. The oldest is 9. When I look at your photograph, I see her. I see my grandchildren. And I realize that the only difference between them and those children in your photograph is the accident of birth. My grandchildren were born into wealth. Those children were born into poverty. But they're all just children. They all deserve a chance to be children. Does this mean you support reform? Samuel asked carefully. It means I'm willing to listen and perhaps to help. I can't change the entire industrial system, but I do have influence. I sit on boards, I know legislators, I fund campaigns. If the committee can present me with reasonable proposals, reforms that don't destroy the economy but do protect children, I'll use my influence to support them. This was more than Samuel had hoped for. He immediately arranged another meeting with the National Child Labor Committee, this time with Harrison present. The industrialist brought practical expertise that the reformers lacked. He understood the economic realities, the profit margins, the competitive pressures that factory owners faced. But he also now understood the human cost. Together, they began drafting proposals for reform. Not radical changes that would face immediate defeat, but practical steps, minimum age requirements, mandatory school attendance for younger children, safety regulations, and yes, requirements that employers ensure their workers had proper protective equipment, including adequate footwear. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his work. He documented more factories, more children, more conditions that needed exposure. But he also made sure to visit Catherine Walsh and her family. He found them living in a cramped tenement in the Irish neighborhood of South Boston, 3 rooms shared by 8 people. Catherine's mother, Anna Walsh, was a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and hands worn raw from laundry work. "Mr. Porter," Anna said when she opened the door. "Catherine told me about you. Come in, though I apologize for the state of things." The apartment was spotlessly clean despite its poverty. Samuel could see the pride in Anna's maintenance of her home, even with so little to work with. Catherine's 5 younger siblings ranged from 3 to 11, all crowded around the small kitchen table doing homework or helping with chores. "I wanted to update you on what's happening with the photographs," Samuel said. "They're being published, and they're starting to create real discussion about child labor reform." Catherine, sitting at the table mending a shirt, looked up with skeptical interest. "Discussion don't pay bills, Mr. Porter." "No," Samuel agreed. "But discussion can lead to laws, and laws can change conditions. I can't promise quick results, but I can promise that people are paying attention now. Your feet, yours, and the other children's, they're making people see what they've been ignoring." Anna Walsh sat down heavily. "Mr. Porter, I appreciate what you're trying to do. Truly, I do. But you need to understand something. When Catherine's father died, we had nothing. The company gave us $20 and told us to be grateful. No pension, no compensation, just $20 for a man's life. Catherine going to work is the only reason we didn't end up in the poorhouse or worse. For $50 a week. That's the difference between surviving and starving." "I understand, Mrs. Walsh. I'm not judging you or Catherine. You're doing what you must to survive. But the system that forces you to make this choice, that's what needs to change." "And if it changes," Anna said quietly, "what happens to us? If they pass laws saying Catherine can't work, how do we eat?" It was a question Samuel didn't have a good answer for. Reform couldn't just take away children's wages without providing alternatives. The committee was discussing this exact problem: how to protect children without destroying the families who depended on their labor. "We're working on that," Samuel said. "Proposals for widows' pensions, better wages for adult workers, programs to help families in crisis. It's not simple, but we're trying to think it through." Catherine looked at him directly. "Mr. Porter, I don't need pity. I need change that actually helps. If your photographs lead to laws that just make it harder for my family to survive, then you've hurt us, not helped us. You understand that?" "I do," Samuel said. "And I promise you, we're trying to do this right." As Samuel left the Walsh apartment, he felt the full weight of the responsibility he had taken on. It wasn't enough to expose problems. The exposure had to lead to solutions that actually improved lives. Otherwise, he was just another outsider causing disruption without bearing the consequences. Back at the committee offices, the work continued. Harrison's involvement had opened doors. Meetings with legislators became more frequent and more productive. The photographs continued to circulate, keeping the issue in public consciousness. Slowly, painfully slowly, momentum was building. But there was also resistance, organized and well-funded. Factory owners formed their own associations to fight reform. They published their own reports claiming that child labor was economically necessary and even beneficial. They lobbied legislators, threatened workers who spoke to reformers, and worked to discredit Samuel and the committee. One evening, Samuel returned home to find his studio had been vandalized. Equipment was broken, negatives were destroyed, and paint had been splashed across the walls. A note was left: "Stop interfering with honest business or next time it will be worse." Margaret found him standing amid the destruction, his hands shaking with rage and fear. "Samuel, this has gone too far. These people are dangerous." "I know," he said, "but stopping now would mean everything we've done was for nothing. Those children are still working barefoot on factory floors. Catherine is still sending home $4.50 a week instead of being in school. The Walshes are still one crisis away from the poorhouse. If I stop now, nothing changes." "And if they hurt you? Or hurt me? Would that be worth it?" Samuel pulled his wife close. "I don't know," he admitted. "I honestly don't know. But I do know that I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't forget those children's faces. And I can't accept that this is just how things have to be." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then she straightened. "Then we'd better make sure we succeed. Because if we're going to risk everything, we might as well win." Together, they began cleaning up the studio. Some negatives were destroyed, but Samuel had made backup prints of his most important work. The photograph of the 5 children was safe. And as long as that image existed, as long as people could see those bare feet and broken shoes on the factory floor, the story would continue to be told. The fight was far from over. But Samuel Porter was no longer alone in it. Winter descended on Boston with bitter cold and gray skies that seemed to press down on the city like a weight. Samuel Porter worked tirelessly, documenting more factories and connecting with other reformers across New England. His photographs had become central to the National Child Labor Committee's campaign, reproduced in pamphlets and presentations that were shared in churches, community halls, and legislative chambers. In January 1904, 4 months after his initial visit to the Lowell Mills, the Massachusetts state legislature began debating a child labor reform bill. The proposed legislation wasn't radical. It would raise the minimum working age to 14, require proof of age before employment, mandate at least 6 months of school attendance per year for younger workers, and establish safety standards including proper footwear for factory workers. These were modest measures, but they represented real change. Samuel attended the legislative hearings, sitting in the gallery and watching as both sides presented their arguments. The factory owners brought lawyers and accountants who testified about economic necessity and competitive pressures. They argued that if Massachusetts imposed these restrictions, factories would simply move to states with looser regulations, taking jobs and tax revenue with them. Then it was the reformers' turn. Dr. Adler presented medical evidence about the health effects of child labor. Lillian Wald testified about the families she had worked with, children scarred by industrial accidents and adults who never recovered from childhood injuries. And Samuel's photographs were displayed on large boards, impossible to ignore. When the photograph of the 5 children with their bare and damaged feet was revealed, a murmur ran through the chamber. Samuel saw legislators lean forward, studying the image. One older representative removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. The image created a moment of silence that felt almost sacred, but then Marcus Thornton, the owner of the Lowell Mills, took the stand. He was a commanding presence, a man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive clothes. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been successfully opposed. "Gentlemen," Thornton began, "I understand the emotional appeal of these photographs. I truly do. But emotion must not override economics and common sense. The children who work in my factory come from families who desperately need their income. If we pass this legislation, we're not protecting these children. We're condemning their families to poverty." He gestured toward Samuel's photographs. "Mr. Porter here has created powerful images, I won't deny that. But he's shown you a moment frozen in time, without context. Yes, some children work without adequate shoes. But do you know why? Because their parents choose to spend the family's limited resources on food and rent rather than shoes. That's not the factory's fault. That's poverty, which has always existed and will always exist." Thornton continued, his voice gaining strength. "If you mandate that we can only employ children over 14, you eliminate work for thousands of families who need it. If you require 6 months of schooling, you reduce already meager family incomes by half. And if you require us to provide footwear for all workers, You add costs that will force us to reduce employment or raise prices, making us uncompetitive. These reforms, however well-intentioned, will harm the very people you claim to help. It was a powerful argument, and Samuel felt his stomach sink as several legislators nodded in agreement. The economics were real, even if Samuel believed they shouldn't be determinative. Families did need the income. Factories did face competitive pressures. The problems were genuinely complex, but then Robert Harrison stood to testify. His presence commanded immediate respect. Here was a man who had built one of America's largest steel companies, a proven capitalist who understood business from the inside. When he spoke in support of reform, the legislators listened differently. Mr. Thornton makes fair points about economic pressures, Harrison began. But he's wrong to claim that reform is impossible or that it will destroy industry. I've spent the last 4 months working with the committee to ensure these proposals are economically viable. They are. What we're asking for is modest and achievable. Harrison picked up the photograph of the 5 children. More importantly, gentlemen, we need to ask ourselves what kind of society we're building. Yes, these families need income. But is the answer really to have 8-year-olds working barefoot on factory floors? Or should we be creating a system where adult workers earn enough to support their families, where widows receive pensions instead of having to send their children to work, where communities invest in education rather than accepting that poverty makes education impossible? He paused, letting his words sink in. I'm not a socialist or a radical. I believe in capitalism and free enterprise. But I also believe that a society that cannot protect its children from exploitation is a society that has failed at its most basic responsibility. These reforms will cost money. They will require adjustment. But they are both necessary and possible. And I'm willing to back my words with action. I've pledged to fund a widow's pension program in Massachusetts as a pilot project. Other industrialists have joined me. We're proving that there are alternatives to child labor if we have the will to create them. The hearings continued for 3 days. Social workers, doctors, clergy members, and parents all testified. Catherine Walsh's mother, Anna, was brought in to speak about her family's experience. She was terrified, having never spoken publicly before, but she was honest and heartfelt. My daughter Catherine is 12 years old, Anna testified, her voice shaking. She should be in school, learning to read better, studying mathematics, maybe discovering talents and interests that could shape her future. Instead, she works 10 hours a day in a textile mill. And yes, Mr. Thornton is right that we need that income desperately. But that doesn't make it right. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to create a better system. She pulled out a worn shoe that Catherine had outgrown. This was Catherine's work shoe last year. Look at it. The sole is almost worn through. The leather is split. We couldn't afford to replace it for months. Catherine worked in the shoe until her feet bled. That's the reality Mr. Thornton didn't mention. Not just that children work, but that they work in conditions that damage their bodies and steal their futures. The testimony concluded, and the legislators retreated to deliberate. Samuel spent the waiting period in a state of anxious activity. He continued his documentary work, visiting factories in nearby towns and collecting more evidence. But mostly he thought about Catherine and the thousands of other children whose lives hung in the balance of this legislation. The vote came in late February. The child labor reform bill passed the Massachusetts House of Representatives by a narrow margin, 112 to 98. It still needed Senate approval and the governor's signature, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress. Samuel immediately went to visit the Walsh family with the news. Catherine answered the door, and he could see the hope and fear warring in her expression. The House passed it, Samuel said. The reform bill. It's not law yet, but it's closer than it's ever been. Anna Walsh joined them at the door. What does it mean for us, Mr. Porter? Practically speaking, if it becomes law, Catherine won't be able to work full-time at the factory anymore once it's enforced. She'll need to attend school for at least 6 months of the year. But the bill also includes provisions for widows' pensions and wage increases for adult workers. Mr. Harrison and others have committed funding. It's not perfect, but it should help. How much pension? Anna asked, ever practical. $6 a week for widows with dependent children. More than Catherine makes now. And if you can find additional part-time work, you'll be better off than you are now. Anna was quiet for a long moment. $6 a week. No child working dangerous machines. Catherine back in school. She looked at her daughter. What do you think, sweetheart? Catherine's expression was complicated. I've been working for 3 years, Ma. I don't even remember what school was like. What if I'm too far behind? What if the other kids make fun of me? Then we'll deal with it, Anna said firmly. You're 12 years old. You deserve a chance to be 12. Over the next month, the bill moved through the Senate. The opposition fought hard, but the momentum had shifted. Samuel's photographs continued to be reproduced, and public opinion was swaying toward reform. Newspapers that had initially been skeptical began publishing editorials in support. Churches organized letter-writing campaigns to legislators. Marcus Thornton didn't give up. He met with Samuel one March evening, requesting the meeting through intermediaries. They met at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant where they were unlikely to be overheard. Mr. Porter, Thornton began, I want to understand your motivations. Are you genuinely concerned about these children, or are you using them to advance a political agenda? Samuel considered the question carefully. I'm concerned about the children. I have no political agenda beyond believing they deserve better than what they currently have. Better according to whom? The government? These families know what they need better than we do. They need income. They need work. You're taking that away from them. I'm not taking anything away, Samuel replied. I'm documenting reality and advocating for a system that doesn't require children to sacrifice their health, education, and future for survival. The current system isn't natural or inevitable. It's a choice we've made as a society. We can make different choices. Thornton leaned back. You're naive if you think this legislation will solve anything. The problems you're concerned about, they come from poverty, not from child labor. Poverty creates the need for child labor. If you really wanted to help these families, you'd focus on economic development and job creation, not restrictions that make their lives harder. Economic development at what cost? Samuel asked. Childhood? Education? There has to be a limit to what we ask people to sacrifice for economic growth. And children shouldn't be the sacrifice. The conversation ended without agreement, but Samuel felt he understood Thornton better. The man wasn't cruel. He simply viewed the world through a lens that prioritized economic efficiency over other considerations. In Thornton's worldview, child labor was regrettable but necessary, a temporary stage in industrial development that would eventually be outgrown naturally as the economy matured. Samuel disagreed fundamentally. He believed that how a society treated its most vulnerable members wasn't a side issue or a luxury to be addressed after economic development. It was the central measure of that society's character and values. In April 1904, the Massachusetts Senate passed the Child Labor Reform Bill by a vote of 22 to 18. Governor John L. Bates, after some hesitation, signed it into law in early May. It would take effect on January 1, 1905, giving factories time to adjust their operations. The victory was significant but incomplete. The law had loopholes and weak enforcement mechanisms. Many factories would find ways around the restrictions. And Massachusetts was just one state. Child labor remained common throughout the country. But it was a beginning, a crack in what had seemed like an immutable system. Samuel received a letter from the National Child Labor Committee congratulating him on his work and requesting his continued involvement. His photographs had become iconic in the reform movement, reproduced and referenced across the country. The image of the 5 children with their bare and damaged feet appeared in textbooks and was used in campaigns in other states. But for Samuel, the real measure of success was simpler and more personal. In August, he received a letter from Catherine Walsh. She had been attending school since the spring, preparing for the official start of the new term in September. The letter was written in careful, practiced handwriting. Dear Mr. Porter, thank you for showing people my feet and the feet of the other children. It felt strange at first, having strangers see something so personal. But I understand now that you were trying to help. I'm going to school again. It's hard sometimes. I'm older than most of the other students in my grade, and I feel behind. But I'm learning. My teacher says I'm smart and that I can catch up if I work hard. Ma is receiving the widow's pension, and it helps. We're still poor, but we're getting by. I don't know if your photographs changed everything, but they changed something. Thank you for that. Catherine, Samuel kept that letter in his desk drawer, pulling it out whenever he doubted the value of his work. It reminded him that change was possible, that individuals could make a difference, and that sometimes the most powerful tool for transformation was simply showing people what they had learned not to see. The battle for child labor reform would continue for decades. But in that moment, holding Catherine's letter, Samuel Porter allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in months: hope. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1906, Samuel Porter stood before a room full of social reformers, photographers, and journalists at a conference in New York City organized by the National Child Labor Committee. The organization had grown significantly, expanding its operations across the country and hiring additional photographers to document child labor conditions in mines, canneries, agriculture, and factories. Samuel's pioneering work had inspired a movement. The conference room was filled with enlarged versions of photographs from the committee's documentation efforts. Samuel's original image of the 5 children with their bare and damaged feet held a prominent position, now recognized nationally as a symbol of the child labor reform movement. But it was joined by hundreds of other images from other photographers and other locations, creating a comprehensive portrait of the scale and scope of the problem. Samuel had been asked to speak about his methodology and philosophy. As he stood at the podium, he looked out at the faces of people who had dedicated themselves to social justice, and he felt the weight of responsibility and possibility. When I took the photograph that many of you have seen, Samuel began, the one of the children at the Lowell Mills, I was trying to capture something specific. Not just poverty, not just child labor, but the particular detail that would make the abstract concrete. The feet. Bare feet and broken shoes on a factory floor. That detail, I believed, would bypass intellectual defenses and speak directly to human empathy. He gestured to the photograph behind him. I was right, but not entirely for the reasons I expected. Yes, the feet were striking. Yes, they created an emotional response. But what really mattered was that they made the situation personal and specific. They transformed child labor from a policy issue into a visceral reality. These weren't just children who work. They were children whose families couldn't afford shoes. Children who walked on oil-stained factory floors with inadequate protection. Children who were literally being ground down by the industrial system. Samuel paused, organizing his thoughts. Since that photograph was published, I've learned several important lessons about documentary photography and social reform. First, images are powerful, but they're not sufficient on their own. The photograph of those children's feet created awareness and emotion, but it took legislation, economic alternatives, and sustained advocacy to create actual change. Images open doors, but you still have to walk through them. He moved to another photograph, this one from a coal mine in Pennsylvania showing boys emerging from the darkness, their faces blackened with dust. Second, we have to be careful not to exploit the people we're trying to help. When I photographed Catherine Walsh and the other children at the mill, I worried that I was using them, turning their suffering into a tool for my own purposes. Catherine herself challenged me on this. She said that if my photographs led to laws that made her family's life harder, then I had hurt them, not helped them. Samuel's voice grew more serious. She was right to challenge me. We reformers, we photographers and advocates, we can sometimes be so focused on the broader cause that we forget about the individual human beings whose lives will be affected by the changes we seek. We need to be humble enough to listen to the people we're claiming to help, to understand their actual needs and concerns, not just what we think they need. A hand went up in the audience. It was Louis Hine, a younger photographer who had recently joined the committee's staff and whose work was already generating significant attention. Mr. Porter, how do you respond to critics who say we're manipulating viewers through emotional imagery rather than rational argument? Samuel nodded, appreciating the question. I'd say that human beings aren't purely rational creatures. We respond to stories and images as much as we respond to statistics and arguments. Moreover, There's nothing manipulative about showing reality. Those children really were working barefoot. Their families really were desperately poor. The conditions really were dangerous. I didn't create those facts. I just made them visible in a way that was harder to ignore. He continued, but I also think the criticism contains a valid point. Images can be misleading if they're presented without context or if they're selected specifically to create an impression that doesn't reflect the full reality. That's why I always try to include multiple perspectives in my work to show the complexity of these situations. Yes, children working in factories is exploitation, but it's also often economic survival for desperate families. Both things are true, and effective reform has to address both realities. Lillian Wald, now a close friend and collaborator, stood to speak. Samuel, can you talk about what's happened since the Massachusetts law was passed? Has it worked? Have there been unintended consequences? The honest answer is that it's complicated, Samuel replied. The Massachusetts law has had real positive effects. School attendance has increased significantly. Documented industrial accidents involving children have decreased. Families receiving widows' pensions report improved living conditions. But enforcement has been inconsistent, many factories have found loopholes, and some families have experienced genuine hardship from the loss of children's income, despite the provisions meant to help them. He pulled out a folder of letters. I've stayed in contact with Catherine Walsh and her family. Catherine is now 14 and thriving in school. Her teachers say she's exceptional, that she might even be able to attend high school, which would have been impossible if she had continued working full-time. But her younger brother Michael, who is now 12, has been trying to find work to help the family, and the law makes that difficult. They've managed with the widow's pension and their mother's income, but it's been tight. The system we've created isn't perfect, but I believe it's better than what existed before. Robert Harrison stood next. The industrialist had become a major figure in the reform movement, using his wealth and influence to support initiatives across the country. I want to add something to Samuel's point about complexity. I've been working with factory owners to help them adapt to the new regulations. Many genuinely struggle with the changes. Profit margins in manufacturing are often thin, competition is fierce, and labor costs are significant. But I've also seen that the difficulties are manageable when approached with good faith and creativity. We need reforms that are both morally right and economically viable. That requires compromise and flexibility from all sides. The conference continued for 3 days, with presentations on legislation, documentation techniques, economic alternatives to child labor, and strategies for expanding reform efforts nationwide. Samuel was energized by the gathering, by the sense of momentum and shared purpose. But he was also aware of how much work remained. On the final evening of the conference, Samuel walked along the East River with Margaret. The New York skyline was lit up behind them, a testament to American industrial power. But Samuel couldn't help thinking about the children who had helped build that power, often at devastating personal cost. What are you thinking about? Margaret asked, taking his arm. I'm thinking about whether we're making enough of a difference, Samuel replied. We've had success in Massachusetts, and there's movement in other states. But millions of children are still working in dangerous conditions. The forces opposed to reform are powerful and determined. Sometimes I wonder if we're just nibbling at the edges of a much larger problem. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Do you remember what you told me 2 years ago, after your studio was vandalized? You said you couldn't unsee what you had seen, that you couldn't accept that things had to be this way. Has that changed? No, Samuel said immediately. No, it hasn't changed. Then you have your answer, Margaret replied. Yes, the problem is huge. Yes, the opposition is powerful. But you're not trying to solve everything at once. You're documenting reality, creating awareness, and supporting people who are working for change. That matters. Catherine Walsh matters. Every child who gets to stay in school instead of working in a factory matters. You're not nibbling at the edges. You're changing lives. Samuel smiled, pulling his wife closer. When did you become so wise? I married a photographer who cares about children's feet, Margaret said. I had to keep up. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, watching boats move along the river. Then Samuel spoke again. "I've been thinking about expanding the project. The committee wants me to document conditions in the South, in the textile mills of the Carolinas and Georgia. The situation there is even worse than in Massachusetts. Children as young as 6 working full days. No education at all. Company towns where workers can't escape." "That sounds dangerous," Margaret said. "The South is less friendly to reformers than New England." "I know, but the work needs to be done. And I think I've learned enough to do it more effectively. Not just documenting the problems, but also finding and highlighting the solutions. Showing what's possible when communities and industries work together for change." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face her husband. "Samuel Porter, you're a good man trying to do good work in a complicated world. I'm proud of you. But please be careful. The world needs reformers, but I need my husband." "I'll be careful," Samuel promised. "And I won't go alone. Lewis Hine wants to work on this too. We'll document together, watch out for each other." In the months that followed, Samuel did travel south, documenting child labor conditions in textile mills, tobacco fields, and oyster canneries. His photographs, along with those of Lewis Hine and other committee photographers, continued to build the case for reform. Slowly, state by state, laws were passed and strengthened. The federal government began to take an interest in the issue, though comprehensive national legislation remained years away. Catherine Walsh continued her education, eventually becoming one of the first members of her family to graduate from high school. She wrote to Samuel regularly, her letters growing more sophisticated as her education progressed. In one letter from 1908 she wrote, "Dear Mr. Porter, I've been thinking about that day you photographed us in the mill. I remember feeling angry that you were focusing on our feet, like you were trying to make us look pitiful. I understand better now. You weren't trying to make us look pitiful. You were trying to make other people see what we had to live with every day, what had become so normal to us that we didn't even think about it anymore. You gave us back our dignity by showing that our situation wasn't normal, wasn't acceptable, wasn't something we should have to endure. I'm studying to be a teacher now. I want to work with poor children, to help them get the education I almost lost. Thank you for seeing us when so many others looked right through us." Catherine, Samuel kept this letter with the others, a growing collection of testimonies from the people his work had touched. They reminded him on difficult days that the work mattered, that individual actions could ripple outward in ways that were impossible to fully predict or measure. In 1910, Samuel was invited to testify before a congressional committee investigating child labor. He brought his photographs, including the original image of the 5 children with their bare and damaged feet. The image was now 7 years old, but it had lost none of its power. Congressmen who had seen it before asked to see it again. Those encountering it for the first time fell silent, studying the details. The exhibition ran for 3 months and was attended by thousands of visitors, many of them young people who had never experienced the era of widespread child labor. For them, the photographs were historical documents of a system that seemed almost incomprehensible. How could society have accepted children working in such conditions? How could parents have sent their children to factories instead of schools? How could factory owners have employed children as young as 5 or 6? But Samuel always reminded visitors that the conditions shown in his photographs hadn't existed in some distant, alien past. They had existed within his lifetime, within living memory. And they had been changed not by historical inevitability or natural progress, but by the conscious, sustained efforts of people who had decided that the status quo was unacceptable and that something better was possible. The lesson of these photographs, Samuel would tell visitors, isn't just about child labor. It's about the power of seeing, of paying attention, of noticing the details that reveal larger truths. It's about refusing to accept that suffering is inevitable or necessary. And it's about the possibility of change even when the forces of resistance seem overwhelming. In his later years, Samuel often reflected on that September morning in 1903 when he had first walked into the Lowell Mills with his camera. He had been uncertain then, unsure whether his photographs would make any difference at all. Catherine Walsh had told him that nothing would change. But both of them had been wrong. Things had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but significantly. Children across America had opportunities that previous generations had been denied. Schools were fuller. Factories were safer. Families had more options. The changes had come through legislation, through economic reform, through cultural shifts in how society viewed childhood and education. But they had also come, in part, through images that had made people see what they had learned to overlook. Samuel Porter died in 1942, at the age of 71. By then, federal child labor laws were in place, compulsory education was universal, and the industrial practices he had documented were largely relegated to history. His obituary in the Boston Globe called him the photographer who showed America its conscience, and his work was recognized as instrumental in the progressive era reforms that had reshaped American society. But perhaps his most meaningful legacy was simpler and more personal. It was in the lives of people like Catherine Walsh, who had been given the chance to become more than their circumstances had once allowed. It was in the generations of children who grew up with education and opportunity rather than factory work and exploitation. It was in the changed understanding of what society owes its most vulnerable members. And it all began with a photograph of 5 children standing in a textile mill, their faces tired but resilient, their clothes worn but clean, and their feet bare and damaged, telling a story that words alone could never quite capture. Those feet had become a symbol, a rallying point, a call to action that had echoed across decades. They were just feet, but they had helped change a nation. The photograph still hangs in museums and archives across America, a reminder of where the country had been and how far it had come. And whenever viewers see it for the first time, they experience that same moment of recognition that thousands experienced in 1903. They look at the image casually at first, seeing children in a factory, nothing particularly remarkable. But then their eyes travel downward. They notice the feet. And in that moment, the ordinary becomes extraordinary, the accepted becomes intolerable, and the possibility of change becomes real. That is the enduring power of documentary photography done with purpose and compassion. It doesn't just record history. It helps to change it one pair of feet at a time.